Good evening and welcome to the fourth of the 5 sets for the presidential election in 2020. It's the penultimate day. It's technically a day and a bit for those that are looking out for Wednesday for us here in Australia. On the back of that, as always, just remember that when I like to do these, I like for questions to come in when they can, and also to have a scenario where if you have a question, please put them out there straight away. And make sure that we can talk to you about it off the bat. I also have, apologies just a moment, working from home. As always, don't forget, everything in this will be general in nature. Everything we talk about tonight is completely general. FP Markets doesn't know your personal scenario, nor do I. Keep that in mind, but it is getting very exciting. And as I said, as I always say, all of this is impartial as I can be. I'm not here to be a cheerleader for one candidate over another, vice versa. I must admit, as I said to you a couple of times before, I don't actually have an opinion either way, and I shouldn't, to be honest with you, because it will cloud your trading judgment. I'm also here to say very clearly what happens for us here in Australia on Wednesday is still very much up in the air. And I'm going to ask this question now. I will come to probably the answer towards the back end. But if you had a choice right now to invest into certain currencies or to trade certain currencies right now, what would you do? And the reason I ask that is that the US presidential election, as crazy as it is right now and as mental as what's going on, it's clearly not the only thing. We have got the most amazing plethora of event risk that we've probably had in most of our lifetimes. Again, Great Depression is probably the only time I can think something like this going on. US presidential election, a global recession, a health crisis like we've never seen in living memory. You've also got geopolitical fallouts, not just in the US, but you've also got Europe. Brexit's coming up. Whether or not that's going to go through on the 31st of December, you've got unrest going across the European Union as well. Clearly, the infighting between Erdogan and Macron is going to be interesting. China is being quiet at the moment, but clearly also has some things going on with Taiwan, if those of you watching out there. So there's just geopolitical risk everywhere. So it's not just the presidential election, and I understand that, but it's probably the biggest thing around, and that I still think needs to be clear. And it gets back to that point that I said, if you had your choice to invest in FX right here and now, what would you do? It's an interesting question, something that I've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, because it does come down to who wins what, how the cards fall with not just who wins the White House, how the House looks, how the Senate looks, who controls that, all of that plays into it. And it's also all what will be the risk factors on Wednesday, so Tuesday for the US. And if you listen to this in Europe, it's Tuesday night for you guys. For us here in Australia, it's the middle of the day. And I'm going to talk now on as Australian time. I've deliberately worked out everything to sort of give you Australian time, because the whole discussion of the day is the risk of the day. What is going to be the risks to your trading throughout Wednesday, because they're going to be large. Having sat on a trading desk 2016, also through the Scottish independence vote, also through Brexit, don't ever forget, FX is over the counter. These markets are made by the investment banks, and they're basically giving each other bid and offers, which then FP Markets prices off. That's all that happens. But if they want to pull their market, they can. It's not like an indice where there is uniformity. There is actually a gatekeeper in like an ASX, for example, or a FTSE or a New York Stock Exchange. There's none of that in FX land, and that's the risk as well. Do not forget, do not ever forget those spreads. If they want to disappear, they will. And that's what you've got to also probably remember when you're trading come Wednesday, that spreads will get wide, and they could get wide quick. They could even disappear for split seconds. So just keep that in the back of your head. So this is the last pickup I had again from RPC data. I've been using this all the way through. RPC, as I said, it is the complete collation of all different voting intentions, surveys, polls, everything you could take your hat off to is there. Because you may have seen today, there was some things out from things like CNBC and also from CNN, one from Reuters that actually suggested that Biden now has a 10 percentage point lead. According to RPC, that's not true. The overall combined, Biden sits at about 7.4. The other thing to highlight, it is a record. There has already been 91.2 million Americans that have voted pre. Just to give you a heads up, that's roughly around about 57, 58% of those that voted in 2016 alone. And why that matters is because one of the biggest issues that will happen on Wednesday is timing. When things can be declared, when those states that we've been discussing, those purple states, when can they be declared and how will they be declared? Clearly is going to come down to mail-in voting, absentee voting, how they go about and when they could go about counting those and sorting those, because they're all different. This is the random beauty that is the US college system, is that it is a jumbled mess of hundreds of years going all the way back to the Constitution, about which states are what, the joining states and exceptions that joining states got. All of that kind of stuff comes to the fore when you start looking at what goes on with the college system and what they're allowed to do. But as I said, this is the most up-to-date scenario. Biden is expected to have 232. There's 125 to Trump. The interesting thing about the 125, that actually hasn't changed pretty much all the way through this period. He hasn't managed to start bumping that up. So there is that there. It's why the bookies, it's why the markets are certainly on the idea that Biden is the front runner. But as we've spoken about before, and I'll come to this as well, where it matters is really tightening. And before I go on, because the next thing I want to talk about is timing and how we're going to look at positioning going into timing. Just to give you a heads up, Florida, the last collective group, there is a 0.7% favoring Biden. That's within more than the standard margin of error, so that's a toss-up. Georgia is also at 0.1% for Biden. That's a toss-up. In fact, I'd still actually say that Georgia's leaning towards Trump. North Carolina is sitting at 1.4 to Biden. North Carolina is seen as the biggest toss-up state around. So again, that you can see is also still there. Pennsylvania is sitting at about 2 to Biden. So it's got a little bit out. It got in as much as 1. But again, that's a toss-up. What has been interesting is Minnesota and Michigan. They've moved out to 4 and 4.5% respectively to Biden. And that's starting to get towards a little bit more leaning towards Biden. And you can see at the top of that chart that Michigan is now in there. You can see that Wisconsin still sits in a toss-up, but in saying that, it's moving ever so slightly to the left-hand side of that chart, and that therefore makes Pennsylvania all that more interesting, because that, if you take those two together, that's 20 electoral college votes. It gets him closer. Trump really does have to get his skates on, particularly in Pennsylvania and Ohio to some extent. I actually believe Ohio is going to go to Trump anyway. But again, it does make this so tight. So election day, what is going to happen? When's it going to happen? Things that you need to know about this time. So this was taken when I did this, and when I got this information, this was done a little way back. So this was done a week and a half ago. So it hasn't jumped up to obviously 232. It's jumped up to 226. As I said, Trump's been sitting at about 125. What I've done here, what I've gone through with the whole publication of this, is to work out what happened in 2016 when these states, the states that matter, don't worry too much about Maine 2nd District and Nebraska 2nd District, because they're not really that big of movements. Obviously, as you can see, they're only 1 electoral college votes. But that 187 missing, so it's obviously 181 now, but that 187 missing, you can see is there. And this is where it matters. This is exactly what at the moment does matter to how this is going to play out on the day. And what you can see there is that the times that it was called in 2016 over in obviously Eastern Standard Time. So obviously those of you that live in New York. And therefore, I've also put the Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Times. First thing to note here, I've put down here at the bottom that note, no Republican president has won the office without winning Florida since 1924. So if there was ever a thing to keep repeating what I've always said to you through these entire times is how important Florida is. If Trump, if he was to lose Florida, history would suggest it is game over. Um, and that could mean, as you can see, Florida was called at 1:53 Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Times. What I would highlight though, and the big caveat to this, and I've actually put together a bit of a fact sheet, run sheet for you guys that FP will send to you. Just be aware, Florida was the thing that actually caused the bookies last time, 2016, to flip at around about 10 to 11. Because the other thing to be watching while you're doing this, not just having your screens up, not just watching the US dollar, not just watching US futures and the bookies. If you've got a TV, have your TV on, try and get it on to something like CNBC or maybe CNN if you can put up with it. Or again, if you can put up with Fox, I probably would suggest you don't use either of those two. For somebody neutral, another one's Bloomberg, for instance. You can get onto Bloomberg quite easily. It's all free these days. They will have a ticking clock at the bottom that's actually vote counters. And you'll be able to see whether or not the lead for Trump in Florida is getting to a point that is actually clear that he's going to win, rather than having to necessarily wait for the actual declaration. But the declaration does matter, because they may take their eye off the ball. Florida, as I said, is the one they're going to be watching quite closely. But if all of a sudden something like Ohio flicked and it was Democrat, that would be a bit of a shock. And that would catch your attention. As you can see, Ohio came in at 121, so a few minutes ahead of time, almost half an hour ahead of time of what Florida was doing. And that's what I mean. Have your eye on those counters. If you can see that certain of these states here, out of the 187 electoral college votes that are going to matter, to go from being Biden sitting at 232 to across the line of 270, or Trump all of a sudden sneaking right up from 125 into it, this is where it's going to happen. And you can see you're going to have a busy day. It's a long day. It really is. In terms of what you're doing, be prepared. In terms of that, Evan, I can see your question, odds update. Odds have got a little bit shorter with regards to Biden this morning. They're now sitting, so you've actually done it yourself. Oh, great. So yeah, Trump shortened into 240 as much as 275, and he's firming in Florida. Yep, knew that. It's also, if you have a look, the interesting thing that I've actually seen is Biden got into as much as $1.25 this morning, and that pushed back out. So it's also there. And that's interesting. So the other thing Evan said here is that Trump is firming in Florida. Coin flip last week as short as $1.60, now favored to take Florida across the board with the bookies. And as I've said to you before, the bookies are pretty good. The volume, they know the volume. They know what's going on. They will be following the volume very closely. In fact, I will slightly go back ahead and Odds Checker. Remember Odds Checker? They take in all of the American bookies. Betfair out of the UK is another really good one because they actually have the volume counting through there. Again, you can just get onto those websites, look them up. They'll be able to tell you the volume going through, and whether or not the odds are moving. You can probably see them relatively live. And as I said, getting back to Florida, when all of a sudden it was clear that Clinton couldn't really catch him, you did see the bookies ditch their markets for about 5 minutes and flip them. So they went from basically being $2.60, $2.50 for Clinton to $2.40, $2.50 to the complete opposite in an instant. And it sent FX markets just all over the shot. And it was one of those events that I spoke to you about at the start that caused a huge gapping, like an absolute enormous gapping issue. And something to be fully aware of with regards to leading up to those times and watching Florida quite closely. I can't tell you more than that with regards to what you do, but for me personally, I probably won't be holding a position as Florida gets closer and closer. I just think the risk is pretty great on the back of it. The other thing about the election coming up that's quite different, and I'm going to show this at the back end of this presentation, but in saying that, I'll say it now. Clearly, the the rhetoric, the vitriol is high. There's also suggestions today coming out from Axon or Axos, depending on how you want to pronounce it, that Trump's actually considering declaring early, even if it's not clear that he's a winner. If it looks like the exit poll suggests that he could win, he's just going to declare. It brings another level of complexity, another level of risk that we just have to deal with. But that also is why this is important, is that the timing for when the full election has been called, again, it's different. And apologies, where has that disappeared? I had the Australian times on there, but that has disappeared off that slide. I do apologize for that. And what I would highlight is 2000. For those of you that are not really aware, Al Gore and George W. Bush fought out a contested election. It did come down to Florida. It went all the way through to the 12th of December because the Supreme Court of the United States voted 5-4 in favor of halting the recount for Florida. And the interesting thing about that is that Florida, as that recount was going along, was inching, and I do say that deliberately, inching slightly towards Gore. It wasn't huge, but it was possibly there. But there was big questions about how the votes were being counted, how they were being done, and in the end, they actually ran out of time, and that's why the Supreme Court of the US came through, halted the count, and with that in mind, they actually basically disregarded the 29 college votes out of Florida, and on the back of that, George W. Bush had enough to get across the line and just pipped Al Gore. So that's the one thing to be aware of. Also, as you can see there, 76 and 2016, we didn't actually get the announcement until well and truly late into the early morning on the Wednesday in the US, which means we may not see a result here in Australia to even as late as around about midnight on Wednesday. The big advantage that we have on this side of the world is that we're awake, ready and going. We get to watch it all day in a normal day completely, and it is fantastic fun. So we will get most of it. You will have a really good chance to actually be positioned, ready, rearing to go for the whole thing through the whole day. But COVID, mail-in voting, as I said at the start, the unpredictability of what Trump could do, again, whether or not Biden has the ability to be confident enough to declare, all of those things make the possibility that 2020 will be an asterisk year. And personally, I think it's going to be, because there is just so many additional things to go with this. So that will therefore bring me to the next part of this question. Why are you doing this? Is delays. And this is what I was talking about at the start. Just apologies. I'll just get you a quick chance of a bit of a read of this. Going back to the states that matter, going back to the purple swing states, what this chart on the left hand shows you is the number of days prior to the election that they can start counting and start processing. And again, as I said to you, under the Constitution, and as new states came in over the years and over the decades from the original, group of 12 states, and it got bigger, there was exceptions to the rule, and they all did things slightly differently, blah, blah, blah. What I'll highlight also is that if the bar chart is slightly to the right-hand side, that means they can start processing and actually counting on election day. And that's what that's to signify. Everything on the other side is they can actually start certain things certain days before. The interesting thing about it is that it varies. So Colorado, they can actually start counting early voters that are actually lined up and gone, but they can't start processing at the same time. So you can start counting 30 days prior to the election, but they can't start processing mail-in votes until 15 days before. But at least they give you that chance. Whereas if you look at something like what's going on with North Carolina, I can start processing up to 35 days before the election, but it can only start getting on with counting 14 days prior. It's more important to have a look at things like Florida there. Florida, at least they've been processing and counting for probably 21 days, which is why, as you can see on the right-hand side, Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Iowa, and Ohio are unlikely to have any sort of delays. The ones to look at straight off the bat is North Carolina and Pennsylvania. The thing that's interesting about Pennsylvania and what happened this morning, if you didn't see it, which would have been last night in the US, is that the head of the Electoral Commission in Pennsylvania, she came out and said it is very, very likely that we will not be able to declare on Tuesday. And that, when I saw that, I had a quick look at the US dollar. It actually put a bit of a blip into it. It wasn't big, but it was a blip. And it was seen as risk off. So the US dollar actually went up slightly, and US futures ticked off just ever so small, but it was there because Pennsylvania, as I've said, is, along with Florida, in my view, the other one that matters. The other state that actually you can see is going to actually to move the dial, and there is clearly going to be delays, and that's why timing is going to be a big problem for all of us in trading on Wednesday, because there is a real chance that it's not just going to be Wednesday. We could be having to deal with this and trading through this for upwards of several weeks. And I think you need to have that in the back of your head. I really do. There is so much going on. There's so much risk, and there's other things going on that you just, the probability of it being delayed, I think, is high and high enough. And that's why you need to be aware of this, particularly Pennsylvania, which, as I've said, 20 electoral college votes. That's a big amount in 187 to be declared, and one of the biggest swing states around, to possibly not be able to declare on the day, because they can accept votes 3 days, up to 3 days after the election itself, which means we could be waiting a while off what's going on. So it just makes things a little bit more interesting and a little bit more difficult, but we will keep on keeping on as we do. The other thing that has to be probably put out there is a recount and a contested election. These are the rules that allow swing states to do recounts. So again, the one to highlight here is probably Pennsylvania. Can the petition go ahead? Yes, it can. Auto recount margin is 0.5. Now, considering that Pennsylvania is sitting at 0.7 of 1%, at the lowest point last week, it's back out to about 1.52, as I said at the start of this, but I still think it's probably towards that. The possibility of having an auto trigger in Pennsylvania, I think, is high. Florida is also going to be well and truly inside that auto retrigger margin, and particularly if Trump loses it by a whisker, he would be crazy not to. He'd be absolutely crazy. I mean, obviously he can't petition for it, but he can certainly make enough noise to suggest that it should be done, if it's 0.5, even if it's 0.59 of 1%. I think you'll have enough, enough gusto, enough thing behind him to say it needs to be recounted. It's a big state. There's a huge amount of population there. Away you go. The other one that's interesting is probably Wisconsin. Although Wisconsin is probably moving away towards Biden, as I said at the start, it's interesting. The only way you get a recount in Wisconsin is actually to have a petition. It's the same in Georgia, probably not as much of a problem, and same in North Carolina. They could therefore, and why that matters is that if you have a contested election and you have to petition to get it done, you start bringing the risk of having the Supreme Court come into play. Obviously, we've just had Amy Coney Barrett being appointed. She is a conservative. The Conservatives now have a 6-3 hold on the Scots, and if it went to the Supreme Court, history tells you, despite it being a slightly conservative bench, history tells you the incumbent has a higher chance of winning than the challenger. And if it went to the Supreme Court, you'd probably back Trump to be the winner. So again, he's got every reason, if he needs to, in these states to petition. It just puts that level of risk. It makes that level of vindictiveness higher. It makes that volatility gauge that we've been watching quite closely just get that ever so stronger. And if you didn't have a look at it, it's back well into the 30s after last week's worst trading week since COVID started in the US. And I don't expect it to get any easier. Just before I go in, don't forget, it's still a normal start to a month. It's the start of November. You've got the Bank of England, you've got the RBA, you've also therefore got the start of the month on a Friday, you've got non-farm payrolls. All of that comes into the other risk event being the US president election. And then the other thing on top of that is COVID. So so much to think about, and it's why markets are so incredibly jittery right now. And as I said to you, just what I also want to highlight, as I said to you before, I'm trying not to be impartial. Trying not to be partial. These are the headlines that you saw this morning. If you were paying attention to them, it was all that was talked about is the fact that Trump actually plans to declare victory if the exit polls suggests that he's ahead. And that's one. What a way to basically create a contested election is to basically say, hang on a minute, I've already won. You know, we're having to go down a contested scenario here because the poll said I won, and that's what the exit poll said, and away it goes. It's a very clever ploy. The man is very, very clever. Never ever write that off. And also, don't think that the vindictiveness doesn't go both sides. So this was Trump this morning, and this was Biden this morning. Okay, the language is a little bit different, but if you look at them, they're pretty heated. And that's why the probability of a contested election, the probability of this going legal, is a reasonable one. I think you've got to probably factor that idea in because both candidates have so much to lose, um, and they are so opposed to each other in terms of not just their ideology, but just personally, it's clear. Both of them have made it fairly personal. Trump's obviously gone after Biden's son. Biden's certainly gone over to Trump himself. He's gone at the way he's handled things personally. He's called him an idiot, the whole nine yards. So it's a personal story, and that's why it will again play out for us, unfortunately, in markets, and that's the way it goes. Now, I'm going to go slightly different here because before I go any further, what I sometimes forget to talk to you about, and I've spoken about this in the third one of these, is that the US presidential election is sometimes forgotten. It's not just about the two candidates tussling it out to who wins the Oval Office. It does actually matter about who ends up in the House and who ends up in the Senate. And the reason for that, I think, for markets is that the Senate is actually now becoming as big a game as the Oval Office run. Why I say that is that 35 seats are up for grabs. I spoke to you about this a couple of weeks back. 35 seats are up for grabs. 12 of them are Dems, 23 of them Republicans. What I'd want to highlight there very clearly, though, is that places like Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, Indiana, these kind of players, they're actually states that don't have candidates up and running. There isn't actually anything to go on there. So they're separate from this. And you can see on the left-hand side, this is the current setup of the Senate. If they're multicolored, they've got a combination of Democratic and Republican senators. So also, as you can see, so up in somewhere like Maine and Vermont on the top right-hand corner, for those of you that know your American geography, there's also a couple of Green candidates in there as well. And that's, and you've got a couple of possibility of independents, but it's very, 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 very rare. Why I highlight this is that there's something quite interesting about the timing of this that goes back to the timing. But the reason I want to highlight it is because also from a market's perspective, I think personally, this is the worst case outcome from a market's idea. Why I say that is that the gridlock in the Senate and the fiscal impasse it will probably bring, I actually think in the interim is going to cause the most amount of shock. You can make, and this gets back to my first thing, if you could invest in currencies right now, what would you do? The reason I say that is that if you look at a blue wave scenario, if you look at what Biden is bringing, there is easy, on theory, a very, very good case he made that the US dollar should fall. Why? We know that he wants to bring in at least $2.2 trillion worth of stimulus for COVID. He does have a slightly more not as open economic policies. We know if you look at energy stocks, they're being smashed up because of what he's talked about with Keystone. He's also likely to be having the probability that he will not just do the 2.2 trillion fiscal stimulus package. There will be several more into the future. That's a lot of stimulus. It's a lot of US dollar printing that hands up into the markets. But if you then argue it from another point of view of not only is he going to stimulate fiscally, he's also got Jay Powell on the other side. Not saying Jay Powell's there to help him because I think he'd do the same thing with Trump. But why I say that is that the Federal Reserve is so clearly ready to jump in. It has the mechanisms to do it. It has the balance sheet to do it. It also has the firepower that cannot be matched by basically any other central bank on the planet. If the two of them were working together as a unit with all that stimulus, short term, yep, US dollar negative. But we're all international investors in the US, if you want to look at it from that perspective. And I would make the argument that what would happen would be domestic recovery in the US, wealth recovery in the US, confidence recovery in the US, and all of those are US dollar positive movers. It's also probably a market, an indice mover off the back of it on a positive side. And that's the interesting conundrum that comes with this whole setup with where we currently sit is the theory suggests that the dollar should do one thing, but whether or not the market flows through on theory is a different story. But getting back to my point of what's in here in front of you is that if, as we're starting to see, that someone like Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Senate, that the Republicans hold on to the Senate, and it's looking possible. In fact, it's more than looking possible. It's looking probable that they'll hold on to the Senate. You could actually end up having not just gridlock, but a real decent standoff. And so much so that maybe nothing gets done. And that would be a double negative in the other direction. It wouldn't just be the fact that there's no stimulus, which is technically probably a dollar positive in the short term. It's the economic fallout from that. It's also the fiscal stimulus fallout that comes with that. It comes also down to the idea that maybe the US's economy won't recover as fast as they could because there's this political infighting going in Washington, and the US has to find its own way. And it comes down to Jay Powell again just doing what he can with a fairly large sledgehammer in QE and any form of currency manipulation that he can put into it, and interest rate manipulations that he can put into the market. And that's the interesting thing that comes about. I showed you this a couple of weeks back as well. And the one to therefore look for is that this is what we're just talking about in terms of that fiscal impulse. But this one here, you can see it's interesting. They actually suggest, according to Morgan Stanley, that there'd be a jump up in terms of the markets. I'm just not so sure. It's actually a fall from when they took this, but I actually think this is likely to be the biggest problem for the markets going forward. And they've got, as you said, a negative number there, but you can just see that there's going to be all sorts of random things that would probably happen inside currency markets with this because the Senate is becoming hostile off the back of it. This would be a better outcome. Trump remaining, in fact, the status quo remaining as is. And clearly having Trump with a red scenario would be definitely better for all and sundry. But what's building up is that possible gridlock, and I just don't know how the market's going to price that, even though, as I said, I actually think that it's becoming the most likely scenario is this one here. Moving on, last slide, because I wanted to actually make it short tonight and make sure that you guys could ask as many questions as you needed to, considering that, I think the question's the most important thing. The other thing to be aware of with regards to the Senate race, and getting back to that map that I showed you before, here are the Senates, here are the actual states that will have a Senate race declared on Wednesday for us here in Australia. I've highlighted very clearly Arizona, Georgia, Iowa, North Carolina. They're the ones that look like swinging in terms of what's going on. What I've also done, and this is absolutely amazing when you look at it, is that getting back to timing right at the start of this whole discussion, is that all of the aforementioned states voted for the same party in the Senate and also the presidential election. So barring Alabama, which was laughed at the presidential declaration with regards to their Senate, you can see that if Arizona was to declare their Senate for the Republicans, then you could probably suggest that the president's going to get the vote as well. It's just that a little extra knowledge in your back pocket. You can therefore have that positioning ready that, if the market all of a sudden starts taking off and you can't see anything going on in the actual presidential debate or race, check your Senates. Has the Senate just declared? Who was it? Did they declare Republican or Democrat? Therefore, okay, Georgia's out of nowhere turned Democrat. Biden looks like he's on to win that state. You can probably move and position in towards it. And that's why, for me, I actually think I'll be watching the Senate race possibly more than actually watching the presidential race, because it's going to be later in the night. And as I said, I actually think it's going to be contested. Senate, I think the Senate will be declared. The Senate's going to be interesting because how the Senate ends up falling, if the Republicans hold on, and as I said, I think they will, it could make the whole day just that little bit more interesting. I'm going to stop there because I think it's the best idea going forward before Wednesday to get you guys out there to ask as many questions. If you've got statements, throw them out there. I will read them out no matter what, because I think, as I said, of all the way through this, as much information or as much debate as we want, I will openly say I'm not right. And if you've got a differing opinion, tell me. Happy to hear it. I'd rather hear it than sitting here and just sort of lecturing to you, because that's not how I feel this is. I truly believe that we've all got an input to put into this. So over on your right-hand side, if you go to Webinar Control Panel, if you want to, just fire through some questions, and away we go. Nobody's got anything to ask at all? If you want to, you can put yourself in there as anonymous. If you don't want me to read you out, I'm happy to do that too. Questions come through. Will gold profit from all this uncertainty? That's a great question, because last week we actually saw gold go backwards, which was not what you would expect. I am with the idea that gold would probably back into this. Gold's probably raced ahead this year. And again, how much of it's COVID is probably the other part of the answer to that question. This question came from Harm. I'll read him out because he hasn't actually put there that he does want it. But it's a fantastic question. Gold, as I said, it's had a brilliant year. It's had an amazing year. Obviously made a record all-time high per US ounce. It has eased right off. And again, it's COVID. I'm just hesitant to say how gold will look to it. COVID has been a big part of it, but the uncertainty that is probably coming for the next 8 weeks is pretty high. As I said at the start of this, it's not just around the US election. It is, do Britain crash out of the European Union? Does the geopolitical issues in the European Union start to really flare up? Does COVID absolutely take off again for a second wave over in the Northern Hemisphere? What China's up to is getting a little bit concerning. So all those are uncertainties. And normally you would see gold on the way up. But it has eased, and last week it eased significantly off all of the other things that are going on. So it's a great question, and I'll put my hand up. I don't know. If there's no more questions, I'll just give it a little bit longer. Oh, here we go. So this is from Evan. Election day is one thing. What should we expect from markets in the days after, e.g. the US dollar? So in the days after, it comes down to a few things. If the election's declared, and again, clear candidate, let's go back to this here. Clear candidate, clear direction from the House and the Senate. There's pretty much this idea of whatever the fiscal input will probably therefore drive the US dollar. Now, on the left-hand side there, you've obviously got CAD, Euro, cable, dollar, yen. That's what they're trading at in terms of what they're talking about. You can see very clearly there that there is certain things that will be dollar negative because they're probably seen as big stimulation, huge fiscal stimulus coming through from the Dems, as I spoke about before. That'll all play out if it's contested, and that's an if. Although I'm sort of leaning towards that. The dollar's direction will probably come down to who's leading, in Florida, if Florida hasn't been declared. Also, whether or not the postal votes are dominating. Does it look like the contested scenario could go to the Supreme Court? If all of that uncertainty comes about, I actually think it's a risk-off event, which probably would mean the US dollar gets bought up. It'd probably mean the yen would get bought up. It'd probably mean the Swiss franc gets bought up. It'd probably see futures all over the shot. Futures markets are going to hate that level of uncertainty, Evan. Not knowing how the cards are going to fall, who's going to end up what, having to wait such a long period of time, and then COVID on top of it. So the risk event, getting back to Harm's question with regards to gold, the contested election, the long drawn out process that could be, would also not just be in gold, but it will flow through into the US dollar and throw through the futures. I'm probably a little bit more certain in futures, considering it's a little bit easier to predict. That level of uncertainty will be a negative. I think that's a pretty clear answer in that market. FX, as I said to you, FX is difficult at the moment, and I really understand that. I love FX, but it's difficult. There's so many inputs in terms of what's going on, and so much talk about X and Y of fiscal inputs or monetary policy inputs, or somebody's withdrawing X, Y, and Z, and it's making it tricky. And don't be disheartened if you're finding it tricky. It is a hard time. Question here from Gavin: if Trump is re-elected, how do you think big tech stocks will be affected, e.g., Facebook, Apple, Google, Netflix? That is, I actually think, Gavin, to be talking about that, I actually think they wouldn't say it publicly, but I think big tech might actually be slightly happier with him in the White House than Biden. Biden's more likely to probably bring a regulatory agenda, and we've already seen 10 days ago, Google now being sued for antitrust. And I think that Biden would follow through very heavily on that, particularly at players like Facebook and Google, considering their control, and they do. Let's be honest, they have a monopoly in their space. Facebook clearly does. Google clearly does. I mean, I think I've spoken about this before. Everybody forgets the second most used search engine on the planet is YouTube. Google owns that. So that there is. I actually think the risk in those FANG stocks, Gavin, is probably more Biden. It's a little bit like what you're seeing played out in energy. It's not as clear cut as that, but we know Biden wants and probably does have a reform agenda, a regulation agenda, and that would probably fall on those four players more so than Trump being re-elected. So I actually think those four might actually see and be slightly relieved by a Trump re-election, although they probably wouldn't play it publicly. They're probably thinking it privately. There doesn't seem to be any more questions. If that's the case, to all of you out there, best of luck on Wednesday. I think there should be, as I said to you, it'll be an amazing day. It'll be a really good experience, and I think you need to look at it from that perspective. It will be a good experience. You would really want to be remembering a few things. Don't forget, just be mindful of your spreads. Add to your winning positions is always the great things, and don't sit on your losses. Simple trading techniques that you all will have gone through, not just with talking to me about this, but just all of those guys out there. Make sure that you understand that your stops can be in a bit of trouble with gapping. Just review your technique, review your strategy, make sure you stick to it, and have that in the back of your head when you do it. I did get one more question with regards to Gavin. Would you say that the XJA will break out of its trading range? It's been in for the last few months. Probably not yet, Gavin. And the reason I say that is if there is risk in the States and futures go down, it'll drag the ASX with it. I would probably state, though, the interesting thing that is happening on a longer view with regards to the Aussie market is that the US actually, out of all of what we've just been discussed, and despite all that risk, has actually just entered economic expansion. So the 7 leading indicators that the MSCI looks at, 4 of them have just gone into expansion at the start of what's now obviously just over a month in October. We may have actually seen a bit of a bump in the Aussie market off the back of it. And why I say that is that every single time that the US expands along with China, the ASX tends to boom. It's a value market. It does therefore do very well during expansion because there is value to be had. And maybe we saw that sort of slight outperformance that we saw in the October month, disregarding the end of last week. Everybody got caught up in that. Was down to that movement. But again, what breaks it out, Gavin, it's a tough one. There's a few things that could happen, but I actually think they're more likely to happen into 2021. Clearly, a vaccine is going to be a big part of that. Any more questions? I'll keep summing up. If they come through, I'll answer them. But as I said, best of luck on Wednesday. We will do one more of these to basically, answer some of the questions that I had in, which is, what would you do post the election? Well, at least we'll have an understanding of what the post-election looks like. Or we might not, inverted commas, if it's a contested one, we could be pushing out to the 12th of December. But like I said, all the best. Enjoy the day. Have as much information with you as you can. As I said, there's a cheat sheet that's going to come through from FP Markets just to give you those 5 things to keep your head on, and make sure the biggest thing I can give to you, make it as simple as you can. If you get too complex, it'll get big on you really quick. So yes, guys, fantastic night, all the best, and talk to you after the big day.